I never believed in ghosts. At least, not until that night. I was driving home late from work, exhausted and barely paying attention to the road. The shortcut I took every night had a notorious U-turn, a sharp bend in the road surrounded by thick trees. Locals whispered about it, saying a woman and her child haunted that spot, appearing every few days, searching for their killer. I always dismissed the rumors. But that night, something changed. As I approached the U-turn, my headlights flickered for a split second. My car slowed, like something unseen was pulling it back. I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding. The road ahead was empty, but I felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like I was being watched. Then, I saw them. A woman and a small child stood at the side of the road. The woman wore a faded red sari, her long hair tangled and covering half her face. Her son clutched her hand, his head tilted downward. Both were unnaturally still. I hit the brakes. "Are you okay?" I called out. The woman slowly raised her head. Her hollow, dark eyes locked onto mine, and an unbearable chill ran down my spine. The boy turned, and his face was blank, featureless. My instinct screamed at me to drive away, but I couldn't move. The woman took a step toward my car, her lips parting slightly. A whisper reached me, though her mouth barely moved. "He took us. He buried us. He still lives." I gasped. The streetlights flickered, and suddenly, I was no longer in my car. I stood in a different place, an old, broken-down house. The walls were cracked, covered in faded red handprints. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth. I saw the woman and her child again, this time inside the house. She was screaming, clutching her son, while a shadowy figure loomed over them. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was their murderer. Then everything went black. I woke up still inside my car, now parked awkwardly on the roadside. The woman and child were gone. But the horror wasn't over. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the vision. It haunted my dreams, their whispers growing clearer. "He buried us under the house. Find us." Determined, I started digging into old records about the area. What I found sent shivers down my spine. Years ago, a woman and her son had gone missing near that very U-turn. No bodies were ever found. But there was a suspect, a man who used to live in a house not far from the road. He had moved away suddenly, and the house had remained abandoned ever since. I knew what I had to do. I contacted the authorities, insisting they check the property. At first, they dismissed me, but when I told them about the visions and the house, something in my voice must have convinced them. A few days later, the news broke. Skeletal remains of a woman and child were uncovered beneath the rotting wooden floor of the abandoned house. The police reopened the case. That night, as I drove past the U-turn again, I felt a strange calm. No flickering lights, no shadows, no eerie whispers. And then, just as I passed the spot where I had first seen them, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The woman and her child stood there, watching me. But this time, the sorrow in their eyes had faded. She nodded once, a silent thank you. Then, as I blinked, they were gone. The night drive. I should have never taken my son out that late. It was past midnight, and the roads were empty, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. My son, Arif, sat beside me, enjoying the rare late-night drive. The cool breeze flowed through the open windows as the car hummed along the deserted highway. For the first few miles, everything was peaceful. But then, Arif's voice broke the silence. "Papa, who is that old woman?" I frowned, glancing at him. His small face was pale, his eyes wide as he stared at the roadside. I turned my head. And that's when I saw her. An old woman stood just beyond the reach of my headlights. She was wearing a torn white sari, her hair matted and unkempt. Her face, it was twisted into something unnatural. She was crying, but at the same time, she was grinning, her lips stretched far too wide. Her sobs echoed in the silent night, yet her laughter intertwined with them, creating a horrifying melody. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Don't look at her," I told Arif, forcing my gaze back on the road. But it was too late. Arif let out a whimper. I turned just in time to see the old woman suddenly standing next to his window. Impossible. I had been driving at full speed. There was no way she could have moved that fast. And then she spoke. Her voice was like the rustling of dead leaves, soft yet filled with malice. She whispered something to my son. I couldn't hear it. But Arif's eyes rolled back, and he let out a small, strangled sound. "Arif!" I shouted, slamming the brakes. The car skidded to a stop. I reached over, shaking him, but he was frozen, his lips trembling, his body stiff. Then, the old woman turned to me. Her grin widened, showing yellow, decayed teeth. "Give her to me," she rasped. I felt my breath itch. "Who?" I whispered. She tilted her head, her bloodshot eyes locked onto Arif. "Give me the boy." My heart nearly stopped. Before I could react, a sudden gust of cold wind blasted through the car. The air became thick, suffocating. And then, another figure appeared. An old man, dressed in a long, tattered coat, stood in the middle of the road. His face was wrinkled, his beard white as snow. But his eyes, they burned with something powerful. "Enough," he commanded. The old woman flinched, her laughter abruptly stopping. The old man took a step toward her. She shrank back, her grin faltering. "You have lingered long enough," he said, his voice echoing through the night. The old woman let out an ear-piercing scream. And then, she was gone. Vanished, as if she had never been there. The old man turned to me. "Leave this road," he said, his voice heavy with warning. "And never bring your son here again." I wanted to ask who he was, what had just happened, but my tongue felt heavy, my body frozen in terror. I blinked. And he was gone too. Arif gasped suddenly, as if waking from a nightmare. He looked at me, his small hands clutching my arm. "Papa, the old lady, she wanted me to come with her." That was enough for me. I started the car and sped away, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who the old man was. But I know one thing, he saved my son that night. My grandfather used to tell me many stories, but there was one that always stood out, the story of his brother, Raghav, and the woman who was not human. This happened decades ago, in our ancestral village, where the nights were darker and the forests deeper. Back then, the village was surrounded by dense woods, and strange things often lurked in the shadows. But none were as terrifying as the story of the ghostly bride. Raghav was a strong man, full of life. He was known for his charm, his laughter echoing through the village streets. Women adored him, and men envied him. But fate had something sinister in store for him. One evening, while returning from a neighboring village, Raghav saw her. She was standing near a lonely banyan tree at the edge of the forest, her long black hair swaying in the wind. She wore a deep red sari, her eyes dark and enchanting. She was breathtakingly beautiful, unlike any woman he had ever seen. "Are you lost?" Raghav asked. The woman smiled, a smile so perfect yet so unsettling. "No, I was waiting for you," she whispered. Raghav felt a strange pull toward her, as if she had cast a spell on him. He couldn't look away. The woman spoke in a voice so sweet, it felt like honey dripping into his ears. Within days, they became inseparable. Raghav was mesmerized, lost in her beauty and charm. No one in the village knew where she had come from, but Raghav didn't care. He declared his love for her and, against his family's warnings, decided to marry her. My grandfather tried to stop him. "Something is wrong with her," he had said. "No one has ever seen her family. No one knows where she lives. She only appears after sunset." But love had blinded Raghav. He ignored the warnings, and soon, a grand wedding was arranged. But that night, something unimaginable happened. The ceremony was beautiful, the entire village gathered to celebrate. The bride was more stunning than ever, her deep red sari gleaming under the oil lamps. But my grandfather noticed something: her feet. They weren't touching the ground. Fear gripped his heart, but before he could say anything, the wedding rituals continued. Raghav and his mysterious bride were married, and soon he took her to his home. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. The next morning, my grandfather went to visit Raghav. He knocked on the door, but there was no response. The house was eerily silent. A terrible feeling crept into his gut. He pushed the door open. The sight inside froze him in place. Raghav lay lifeless on the bed, his body drained, his skin pale as death. His eyes were wide open, his face twisted in horror. His hands were curled into claws, as if he had fought something or someone. And the bride, she was gone. There was no trace of her. Terrified, the village called for the elders, and a priest was summoned. He examined the body and looked around the house. Then he spoke the words that made everyone shiver. She was not human. The priest explained that the woman was a churel, a vengeful spirit that seduced men and drained their life force. Some spirits seek revenge, others seek peace, but a churel seeks power. By marrying men and consuming their souls, she grows stronger. Raghav was just one of her victims. Determined to stop her, the village elders and the priest prepared a ritual. They knew she would return for another man. That night, they set a trap near the banyan tree where she had first appeared. A young man was chosen to lure her out, and the rest of the villagers hid in the shadows, armed with sacred ash and iron weapons. Just past midnight, she appeared. She emerged from the darkness, her sari fluttering as if the wind carried her. But this time, she looked different. Her beauty was fading, her face slightly distorted. She had fed on Raghav, but she needed more. The young man smiled at her, pretending to be entranced. And just as she reached for him, the villagers attacked. The priest threw sacred ash at her, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. Her once beautiful face twisted into something demonic, her eyes burning with fury. She fought back, her nails sharp as claws, but the villagers were relentless. With chants and fire, they drove her into a pit and sealed it with sacred markings. The priest warned that she wasn't truly dead, just trapped. She will wait, he said. One day, if the markings fade, she will return. Years passed. The banyan tree where she was buried still stands, its roots wrapped tightly around the cursed ground. The elders say no one should go near it after dark. Some nights, when the wind is still, people say they hear whispers coming from beneath the tree. A soft, sweet voice calling out, "I was waiting for you." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video to show your support and help us create more content like this. Share it with your friends and family who love thrilling and spooky tales. Comment below your thoughts, theories, or your own scary experiences. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe to TerraFlix and hit the bell icon to never miss a chilling story. Stay tuned for more spine-tingling adventures.